As we discussed in the previous section, winning teams don't remain static. Their members grow, change roles, and in some cases, move on. Some will move on to bigger and better things, and even to leading teams of their own, something that should put a huge smile on the team leader's face. And some will need to move out of the organization to find different opportunities that are a better match for their talents. With these changes, you'll need to be constantly thinking about how to build your team by adding new members. In this section, we'll address how to identify inside candidates who are best suited for an open position, how to identify outside candidates who are best suited for an open position, how to be a more effective interviewer when screening candidates, how to conduct more effective reference checks.
In many large organizations, formal succession plans are designed to monitor a manager's performance in a variety of positions over an extended period of time. These plans help identify good internal candidates for promotion and change of roles. In some companies, inside candidates are identified through peer assessments, which can be extremely useful tools for identifying strong potential leaders. Colleagues' evaluations of a manager may be drawn from the 360-degree performance reviews that many companies now use. These reviews include feedback not only from people's bosses, but also from those who report to these candidates and peers who work with them. In some cases, companies structure a tailor-peered assessment designed to identify candidates for a particular position. There are, however, less formal methods for finding internal candidates by simply talking to people about your team's needs and having them identify candidates who might have the right stuff. Years ago, GE's then CEO, Reginald Jones, asked a number of his key executives who should replace him if he were to die in a plane crash. You won't be surprised to hear that the most frequent answer was Jack Welch. Whether using a formal succession plan, structured peer assessment, or less formal methods, you must keep your eyes and ears open for people within your organization that you might want to join your team. Great managers constantly network and seek information about rising stars and begin identifying good internal candidates before they need them. While the reach of electronic media and recruiting tools has been a tremendous boon, there is much to be said for old-fashioned word of mouth and getting personal recommendations. Most managers interact every week with dozens of different sources of potentially great new hires. Think about it. Think about your suppliers, your customers, agencies in your industry, trade associations, journalists, and even consultants who may be brought in to do work for your organization on a temporary basis. All these people know people, and many of them know your industry very well. There is a huge wealth of talent in those connections. Use them. Whether you are hiring from the outside or bringing on internal candidates, it's all but impossible to make valid appraisals solely on the basis of job experience, as described on someone's resume. That's because it's highly unlikely that your candidate is now, or has previously been, in a job with exactly the same goals, challenges, resources, and circumstances. When jobs are unique, as is frequently the case, intangible traits can make the difference between average and outstanding performance. So what do you do? Jack advises following a two-step approach to hiring based on competencies. First, you must be very thoughtful and specific in defining the competencies required for the open job. And second, you have to uncover the true competencies that each candidate possesses. While most managers have a generic list of the competencies they're looking for, it is vital to test these assumptions. Don't assume that a fairly generic job description, especially if it's one you've inherited, is necessarily going to capture the true competencies needed in the role. When filling a role that has become vacant, ask yourself what competencies the previous person in that role possessed that enabled them to excel. Or, if they didn't excel, what were they missing? Identify those competencies and make sure you explicitly articulate them as you seek out candidates. If it is a new role, then admittedly, defining all the competencies may be a little more challenging, since there are all sorts of requirements that can surface over time that no one could have predicted. In either case, however, you have to put some real thought into this. If you are sloppy in defining the competencies you need, you are going to be sloppy in uncovering them in the candidates you interview. Let's now turn our attention to the interview process. While many interviewers are ineffective at uncovering competencies, those who employ structured techniques will be more effective than those who conduct unstructured interviews. Structured interviews are built on a sophisticated analysis of the relevant competencies to be assessed, as well as careful thought about the questions to be asked. Two types of structured interview are particularly reliable across a wide variety of jobs. One is the behavioral interview, which is built around questions aimed at understanding what the candidate has done in actual situations. The other is the situational interview, which is built around questions that probe what the candidate would do in various hypothetical job-related situations. When a candidate has relevant experience, the behavioral approach is preferable, as it focuses on facts rather than on speculation, and offers an opportunity to probe more deeply into a candidate's action and choices in a similar situation. When the candidate has no relevant experience, the situational interview is often the better alternative.
While we've only scratched the surface of the art and science of conducting effective interviews, the one message that should be clear is that the goal of the interview is to uncover what a candidate has done in the past and to use that to make an informed judgment about what that person could do in the future. Both behavioral and situational approaches require significant preparation, including a detailed plan for each meeting that specifies the competencies to be investigated and the questions intended to measure that competency. In your playbook, you'll find support tools and guidelines on this topic. As we've discussed, your questions should be focused on behaviors and should be followed up with significant probing in order to understand candidates' actual role in events and, just as important, the consequences of their actions. However, while conducting effective interviews is critical, there is one other piece of the puzzle that gets overlooked far too often: the reference check.
Very few hiring managers like to make reference checks. They are time-consuming and often awkward. And to make matters worse, many former employers tend to soften criticism in these kinds of conversations for fear of legal action. And yet, most experts agree that reference checks may be the only way to turn up information about a candidate that would point toward unsatisfactory job performance. As such, reference checks are an essential component for success in any assessment, and they must be done properly. So, what does doing a proper reference check really mean? Well, let's step back for a minute and think about what we're trying to accomplish. Reference checks serve three primary purposes. First, they can be used at an early stage to verify the candidate's basic credentials and to get rid of the outright fakes. Second, reference checking is also useful for gaining an assessment of a candidate's hard-to-quantify competencies, such as those related to emotional intelligence, which are relatively hard to verify but are critical to success. And finally, checking references helps you gauge growth potential, helping you to determine a candidate's likely future success in the position. Once we're really clear on what we're trying to accomplish in conducting reference checks, there are several tactics that should be used. First of all, do not just call the references the candidate supplies. Call individuals in the same industry who have had contact with the candidate. Call suppliers, customers, or competitors of the candidate that you may know. In fact, you should work with the candidate to develop a list of additional names that will give you the kind of information that suits your purposes rather than hers. Second, decide who to call based on the type of competencies you are trying to assess. A former boss might be good at assessing strategic orientation and implementation skills. A peer would be well-positioned to comment on collaboration and influencing skills. Former direct reports could describe the candidate's competence in the area of team leadership and their ability to develop others. Third, interview your references in a structured manner that focuses on behaviors, the same approach you take in interviewing candidates. Plan your questions about the relevant competencies you want to check. And finally, don't listen for what you want to hear about a candidate. Yes, you have a job to fill. Yes, you want the process to be over quickly. But when conducting a reference check, listen for hidden messages. Listen for what is not being said.
As Jack has said many times, references will tell you what you need to know, but only if your ears and mind are wide open. He also added that he never trusted the references supplied by a candidate. In his own words, they're not enough by a long shot. Identifying internal and external candidates to join your team is crucial. Once you find potential candidates, conducting effective interviews and reference checks will improve your success rate. This is hard work, but essential for building winning teams. So, be thoughtful. Define the competencies you need in the candidate. Be structured as you prepare for the interviews, and be thorough as you conduct reference checks.